Have you ever studied abroad? Would you like to study abroad? It seems that young people today are increasingly interested in getting at least a part of their education in another country. Hi, my name is Melissa Siegel. I'm a professor of migration studies, and this is a channel about all things migration. And today we are talking about international students or migrant students or international student mobility, whatever term you want to use. We are talking about people getting education in another country than the country that they were born, for example, or at least in another country perhaps than they have citizenship. Now let's get right into it. So what is an international student, or what is the definition of an international student? So an internationally mobile student is an individual who has physically crossed an international border between two countries with the objective to participate in educational activities in a destination country where the destination country is different from his or her own country of origin. So this is the definition from UNESCO. Now, there are different types of student mobility. So we can have student mobility for a specific degree. So that is when someone goes abroad to complete an entire degree abroad. So that could be, for example, an entire bachelor's program. That could be an entire master's program. In some cases, maybe an entire PhD program. But we also have what's called credit mobility. These are shorter term, more temporary periods abroad. So you can think about these like an exchange or a semester abroad. In the European context, it's also often called going on Erasmus or being part of the Erasmus program. So these are already two different kinds of student mobility that we see. And we can also categorize this as vertical mobility or horizontal mobility. So what is vertical mobility? Vertical mobility is when the migration happens between countries with differences in development of their higher education systems. So think about someone migrating from a developing country to a developed country to study abroad. Now, horizontal mobility is when someone migrates between equally developed higher education institutions, between developed countries. So for example, as many of you know, I'm based in the Netherlands. I work at Maastricht University and the United Nations University, and we have a lot of German students that come to Maastricht University to study. This would be considered horizontal mobility. Now let's look at some key trends with regard to international student mobility. And a lot of this information is going to come from the OECD, and specifically the OECD highlights. And we're going to particularly talk about the year 2019, which, given the current context and the fact that we've just basically come out of COVID, makes a lot more sense to understand kind of what the status quo should be and probably will be also in the future. And as usual, I'll make sure to link all of the sources in the description below in case you'd like to follow up on any of those. So now let's look at some facts, some figures, and what's going on in the world today, or what was going on in 2019. So the largest flow of international students is actually from developing countries. Around 67% of all international students in the OECD are coming from developing countries. Of this, 3% are from low-income countries, 26% are from lower-income countries, and 38% are from upper-middle income countries, which makes sense. You generally already need resources, you already need a decent level of education to usually be able to migrate abroad for higher education. Now, Austria, Colombia, Greece, Indonesia, Korea, Poland, and the Slovak Republic have more than 55% of internationally mobile students in 2019 coming from neighboring countries, actually. So in these countries, the majority of the students that are international students are coming from abroad are actually coming from just bordering countries. Now, women are also less likely than men to enroll abroad in the field specifically of engineering, manufacturing, and construction. So actually 29% of international students in this field are women. And women are more likely to study abroad in the fields of arts and humanities. So the share of women is around 62% in this area, as well as in kind of healthcare, health, and welfare. Also, we see a lot of women migrating internationally to study in this area. Now, most countries are actually net importers of students. That is in the OECD, right? So most countries in the OECD are net importers of students. That is, they actually have more students coming into the country to study than they have students leaving the country to study abroad. So in total, across all of the OECD countries in 2019, there were 3 international students being hosted for each national student studying abroad. But this ratio equals or exceeds 10 actually in Argentina, Australia, New Zealand, the United Kingdom, and the United States. So what does that already tell you? That tells you that countries like the United States, the United Kingdom, Australia, New Zealand, and Argentina are major receivers of international students, and actually at higher rates than other OECD countries. So the number of international and foreign tertiary students grew actually on average by around 5.5% per year between 1998 and 2019. So this really just shows the growth of student mobility over time. So students are actually more likely to travel abroad for more advanced educational programs. In all but a few countries, the share of international students enrolled in tertiary programs increases gradually with the education level. So what does that mean? That means that we see a lot more international students enrolled in master's programs and in PhD programs than we do in bachelor's programs. So we see a lot more mobility the higher the level of education. So while most countries have higher shares of international students abroad at the doctoral level than at the master's level, a number of countries show the opposite pattern. This is particularly striking in Australia, Germany, Latvia, Lithuania, and Poland. While women do outnumber men among entrants and graduates from tertiary education in general, they are about as likely as men to enroll abroad in the field of social sciences, journalism, and information. However, they're much less likely to do so in the field of engineering, manufacturing, and construction, as I've already mentioned before, but we do see them much more likely to enroll in the fields of arts, humanities, health, and welfare. As I've mentioned before, of course, we've seen this steady rise in international mobility of students over time. We do see that the regions hosting international students are mainly North America and Western Europe, followed by East Asia and the Pacific, and then we have the Arab states and Central and Eastern Europe, then Latin America and the Caribbean, and then Sub-Saharan Africa, South and West Asia, and Central Asia. So really, the majority of international students today are being hosted in North America and Europe. If we also look at the top 5 countries that are sending international students abroad, that's China, India, Vietnam, Germany, and France. So we're actually seeing quite a mix of the countries that we see sending international students. Now, of course, there are both benefits and challenges to migration in general, and that is no different for international students. Now, of course, domestic students actually often benefit from having a very international classroom. And what does that mean? So having a more diverse classroom, particularly in higher education, is generally associated with improved learning outcomes. You also see changes in perspective and innovation within the classroom. We also see an increase in intercultural skills and understanding, and also improved language skills for domestic students, so not only for the international students themselves. So these students are also able to benefit from international networks and friendships, so they get to know each other, they get to know each other's traditions and customs, and sometimes we see this working also through buddy programs. And what it really does is, not only for international students, but also for domestic students, it helps to actually prepare them for a future as global citizens and maybe also having international careers. Now, of course, there are also challenges, particularly for the migrant themselves. So there's definitely adjustments with regard to integration. So sometimes there can still be language barriers, cultural shocks, homesickness. Sometimes there's a lot of pressure to meet expectations from families and institutions back at home. And often people are coming from different academic environments and studying methods and have to get used to these things. Sometimes we also see administrative and bureaucratic challenges for international students. Students can also sometimes face discrimination, and we also see that housing can also pose challenges to students. So particularly finding housing in destination countries if the hosting institution does not help with that. And of course, there's also the actual costs. So we have tuition fees, administrative costs, visa fees. Sometimes there are also requirements for financial reserves of some countries that to actually get a visa to study in that country. So sometimes international students have a greater financial burden and almost a double financial burden compared to native students in the country where they are studying. Additionally, there can also be issues to the access to the labor market. So it is very common for students while they're studying to also have side jobs. That's normal for native students, and of course it's often the case that international students would like to do the same thing. But sometimes there are restrictions for them. So the ability to work might actually be restricted. They might need to obtain a permit, and sometimes this can be difficult and time consuming. Sometimes they are restricted completely from working, other times not. This really depends on the country of destination. Now, of course, there are also benefits for the higher education institutions where the migrants are going. One is definitely financial benefits. They often get an increase in income. They have an additional funding opportunities. This is especially important where financial contributions of governments are decreasing in higher education. Now, of course, there are also academic benefits. We do see that there is an advanced quality of education due to increased competition for the most talented students and academics worldwide. We also see an improved reputation and rankings and visibility for higher education institutions that have a lot of international students. We also see the linking of universities worldwide and international research and collaboration. So we see a lot of benefits on the academic side for having international students. Happy international students in general can be great ambassadors for their institutions back in their countries of origin and also in other countries that they might go to in the future. Now, of course, there are also challenges for higher education institutions that have a lot of international students. So there might be issues around language skills of the students and the staff. There's, of course, the need to often provide more services specifically to international students, things like helping to facilitate with housing and just getting to know the country or cultural environment that they are coming into. There's also the risk, at least, of kind of squeezing out or pushing out qualified national students in some country contexts. There's also a risk of only being accessible for students with financial resources. So that means that there's definitely a selection of who ends up going into higher education. And that means that those that are already often in a better financial position and those that often already have a better socioeconomic background are the ones that are actually getting access to this international mobility. We can possibly see some increased competition, and we can sometimes see an overemphasis on internationalization at the expense of other priorities. So these are some of the challenges that higher education institutions can face. Now, if we look at the destination countries themselves, there are a number of benefits that the destination country has. So of course, there's the economic benefit of having these students come into the country, live there, spend their money there. So in the short term, at least, there's additional revenue to higher education institutions, but also to the community that the students come into more generally through obviously the living expenses and maybe their family visiting that brings in additional revenue. In the longer term, if they're able to retain the international students, they can actually expand their domestic pool of highly skilled workers. And this can be facilitated through orientation years after graduation and specific policies that governments can put into place, which we do see some governments doing, particularly in OECD countries. Particularly also where we have demographic considerations, where we have aging populations in some countries. Having international students stay on also after they graduate can really help to meet needs of industries. They can also contribute to knowledge creation, productivity, innovation, and global competitiveness, as well as becoming entrepreneurs in those countries of destination. If you're actually interested more in the links between migration and entrepreneurship and migration and innovation, you can check out my videos on this channel also having to do with those issues. Now, International students can also be seen as ambassadors to recruit more talent, and they can help to strengthen international cooperation between countries. So we can see an increase in cooperation with regard to trade, business, and science, all because of international students coming into a country. Now, of course, there are also challenges for a country. Migration in general is quite a sensitive topic, and these are often sensitive topics of public concern. So migration and education can also both be sensitive topics that maybe also have quite a bit of misinformation around them. There can also be an abuse of the student visa system, so people coming in looking like they're international students but actually not studying and doing other things in the country. There can also be a possible misuse of other services when any migrant comes into a country, although we don't have a lot of evidence for that. And one area that we do see, particularly in areas that have high concentrations of people or are very populated, we can sometimes see more pressure on housing and housing resources, where there's more pressure than on the housing market and we see more housing shortages. Now, there can also be benefits for the countries of origin that the migrants are coming from. So those could be both financial and social remittances. So if you want to know more about remittances in general, you can check out other videos on remittances on this channel that talk both about financial remittances and social remittances. But we can see both of those things coming back to the country of origin because of the migrants or the international students that are abroad. If students also return home after graduation, they can contribute to the development in their home countries with their newly gained knowledge and skills. In many cases, they've had technological upgrading and capacity building, and that can all be extremely beneficial for the countries of origin. They can also help to strengthen international cooperation, as I said before, between both of the countries. So this is good for the country of destination, but it's also really good for the country of origin, again, in trade, business, science, and other areas. And we also see an increase then of global knowledge networks. And these global knowledge networks, the people who have gone abroad can then bring the countries of origin into these more global knowledge networks. Now, of course, there are challenges, right? There are issues with, a lot of highly skilled people going abroad. Of course, many countries would like their people to go abroad and get more educated and come back. But if people just get more educated and stay abroad, if they don't keep ties with the country of origin, this can cause some issues and some frustrations and some difficulties. If they do keep strong contacts, then we see more benefits than we do challenges. We could also see a reverse culture clash, so that when people come back after having experiences and gotten used to the cultural situations in the countries of destination, they might come back and then have trouble kind of reintegrating culturally back in their country of origin. Sometimes there are also administrative difficulties. So sometimes there can be issues with regard to the recognition of diplomas between countries and whether or not the diplomas that migrants have gained abroad are going to be recognized back in their country of origin. Now, there's also a financial side to this, a financial issue. So, there can be issues for governments who may have paid scholarships for students that end up not returning and not contributing to the country of origin. And of course, this can be a little bit complicated, but there are plenty of policy solutions that can also help to deal with this. So finally, I hope this has given you a general overview about the situation of international students, international student mobility and migration. And what we really do see is that more and more nowadays, there is really an internationalization of higher education institutions. At least we definitely see this of the top institutions. That's also very important, and we're going to probably see it increasing because of an increase in globalization and the growing importance of knowledge and the transfer of knowledge and diffusion of knowledge. There are plenty of benefits to everyone involved, to the students that go abroad, to the students that get to study with them, to the academic institutions where the students are going to, and to both the country of origin and country of destination. So there are a lot of really positive benefits that generally outweigh any negative challenges that can come up also because of student mobility. Now, if you've been an international student, if you would like to study abroad, please do comment down below. Let us know your own experiences. And if you like this video, give it a thumbs up. If you haven't done so already, make sure you subscribe to this channel and hit that notification bell so you don't miss any of the videos that we upload every week on different migration issues. And I definitely hope to see you next time. Bye-bye.